In this video, we are installing complete full exhaust, including long tube headers from Hooker Headers on my 1978 Dodge Power Wagon. We are going to jump right into the installation, but first let me flip the camera around and talk you through everything I purchased, because if you're doing this at home, you're going to want to make sure you buy everything in one shot and you're not running back to the parts store. Let me show you what I got. Here are the Hooker headers. Now these are a more budget-friendly option. These are just painted regular, non-high temp paint. You can get these ceramic coated, chrome, bunch of different things. This is part number 5902. I believe these have 1 5/8 inch primaries and a 2.5 inch collector. So this is perfect for a very mild 360 Mopar. The headers themselves are gonna come with gaskets, which is great. Now, if you do want to reuse your stock manifold hardware, what I would recommend doing is investing in a helicoil set, because let me tell you, a lot of times some of the stock fasteners are broken and they are a pain to remove. Here is the part number for ARP 144-1102. ARP hardware is fantastic. They also have smaller heads, which give you more clearance when you're installing your headers. So that kind of covers the hardware. You will need some way to bolt onto your collectors, just like so. So these are a 2.5 inch by 3-bolt flange collector that I got from Summit Racing. They also come within the package the correct hardware for these, so 6 bolts, nuts, washers, and also the gaskets. Now, if you're doing a full exhaust, I would highly recommend adding some sort of crossover pipe. This is an X pipe, you can do an H pipe, or you can do true duals, but any sort of crossover pipe will improve scavenging, which improves performance, and they're not that expensive. If you have an oxygen sensor like I do, which is installed in my truck, you're gonna need to buy yourself an oxygen sensor bung. There is the part number right there from Summit. If you don't have an O2 sensor, don't worry about this, but you will see later in the video, I'm going to drill in there and weld this in so we can have an oxygen sensor in the collector so we can monitor and tune the truck. The next part is extremely important. In order to fit these headers on your truck, you are going to need to remove the stock starter. Now look how much bigger the stock starter is versus an aftermarket starter. So this is a starter for like a Dodge Magnum, and this is going to allow you, you got to take it off anyway. This is going to allow so much more clearance. They don't specifically say you need this smaller starter, but if you read online, it helps a ton. This is a high torque starter. It's brand new. This one is the old original one that was in the truck. I recommend picking one of these up. And let's see if I've got the part number here. I do. That is the part number for that starter. This is like a smog motor like mine. You're gonna need to install, and I'll show you zoomed in here, plugs on your heads to plug the stock smog ports. Okay, that's everything you need to buy. Let's dive into the installation. Show you some issues that I know we're gonna have. They're gonna make this much more difficult than just your standard installation. So without further ado, let's take a look. Front and rear, I believe, are studded. So you remove the nut, the stud remains, and that goes into a water jacket, which we could just leave it when we install our new headers, except they're broken on the other side, which sucks because that's the harder side to get to.
Okay, pro tip here. I, like weeks before I started this, went and hit all of these fasteners with PB Blaster to try and loosen them up. You want to take your time here and not break anything. As I mentioned, I've got 2 broken fasteners already, but if you break any more, then you have to address them, and it sucks. Listen, don't be surprised. If you do remove the front and rear studs, coolant will come out.
So I can show you this next part, which kind of sucks. So, believe it or not, I was able to undo these rusty old bolts. And that first one, sorry, that is undone where you don't see the studs sticking out. And surprise, neither are studs. They are bolts. That first one, you can have a helper get on top and hold it for you. The other one, best thing I could do was use one of these guys right here, pair of vice grips, and clamp the stud itself and then get your impact on the nut. Be very careful though, because you're right around the exposed wiring of the starter. And if you're doing these headers, the starter's gonna have to come out anyway for pretty much any header that you put in to put in a mini starter. So it's probably not a terrible idea to undo the battery. I didn't do that. Either way, we're loose now, just resting on the frame back there. Don't worry, it's not resting on this wire. We'll undo the last bolt for the header or the stock manifold and pull it out the top. There you go. Hey, wow, came right off. Is there even a gasket in there? I don't even think there's a gasket. There wasn't even a gasket in there.
Won't bore you with removing the other side, it's the exact same idea. Here's me trying to unsuccessfully weld a washer and nut onto that broken stud. I try to do this honestly 6 or 7 times. The main problem I ran into is with iron heads, you've got to be really careful that you don't accidentally weld your nut to the head itself. But the iron head acts like a heat sink, so it's very difficult to get in there to get a good penetration weld to where you can back the nut out. I've done this successfully in aluminum parts before, but it just didn't work, and ultimately I had to drill it out. Once you've either removed the broken stud or drilled it out, you need to go in there, clean up that hole, and then tap new threads. In this case, I'm drilling an oversized hole and tapping threads for a helicoil, and I'm going to do this on both the front and the rear. This adds a ton of time. Be very careful. If these aren't exactly perfectly straight, it's going to make header alignment later a problem. Just hope your bolts aren't broken. This next step is only going to apply if you want to install an O2 sensor. I do have a wideband in my truck, as I did with all my carbureted vehicles for tuning. So I went ahead and drilled a hole using a step bit and welded in the bung on the driver's side header right before the collector flange. Go into there and we're going to clean the connections and then the mounting surface. It's hard to see in there, but we got to get that all nice and clean up the terminals so that when we make connections to our starter, we don't have any issues. And it says that in the instructions too, by the way, if you read the instructions. With the starter removed, the driver's side header installs without any issues. Actually, it's one of the easiest headers I've ever installed on a vehicle. There's plenty of clearance around everything. And as long as you don't have any broken bolts on this side, it's gonna be a breeze. So we got the header in, but it's just loose. And the studs are nice because you can hang it up on there and just throw a couple of threads on. We've got the starter in there. The next thing to try and see is, will the stock leads, which are your 2 starter wires, reach the new starter now that it's a little bit smaller and not contact any of the primary tubes? If it does, we've either got to reroute it or, better yet, go buy a longer terminal, make some new terminal ends, and rewire it. We're going to crawl underneath and check that, and then we're going to get everything down there kind of buttoned up starter-wise before we come up top. I'm going to show you a trick with these gaskets. There you go. This stuff right here. This spray sealant, or this spray gasket. I use this stuff. Oh, it's starting to run out. I use this stuff on header gaskets, and it creates a really good bond and prevents leaks. So we usually coat the gasket with that first, but we don't want to coat anything until we make sure everything will fit, because then we're just kind of a mess on our hands. I didn't show you, but underneath the truck, we did verify that everything mounted up fine. We didn't have any issues with any wiring, and our O2 sensor leads, everything's gonna work. So we buttoned everything else up underneath the truck that we could, and now we're just coating this gasket and getting ready to install it from the top so we can tighten everything up and basically finish up the driver's side. You do wanna make sure you coat both sides of this, and this is very sticky, so it's probably not a terrible idea to wear gloves. It really does help seal everything up though, in my experience. Okay, I want to put some anti-seize on these ARP bolts, and make sure when you put the washers on that the tapered side goes towards the head of the washer, so the flat side is towards the header flange. We'll go ahead and put these in. I got the passenger side. Header is in the car. I totally jinxed myself because that driver's side header, it drops in like a glove. The passenger side header, on the other hand, fits great once it's in. Once it's in place, it's not going to bump anything. These headers actually have a ton of clearance around the frame. But being that this is a 4-wheel drive, the instructions say on a 1977 model, you might need to disconnect the front drive shaft. Mine's a 78. I did disconnect the front drive shaft, which is like 4 3/8-inch bolts. Just pulled out of the way. Helped a little bit, but ultimately, I really think there's only 2 ways to get this in, and that is either undo the passenger side motor mount and just jack the motor up ever so slightly. I also jacked up the truck and let the suspension droop. But I only did that on one side. So actually I may have gotten even more clearance if I would have lifted the truck up like they said in the instructions. If you remember, they say you need 36 inches of clearance, and ultimately what I did was just shave a very tiny bit of material off the frame rail to clear one of the primary tubes, and then it more or less went into place. I'll show you what I mean. So kind of down where my light is shining right there, you can see where I did a little trimming. And you can see where it was all bumped on that number, I don't know, the 3rd one in. Basically, you got to bend the transmission dipstick tube, which I think I showed you earlier, but it's just, this side is a bit more of a pain, and because I had those broken studs, I had to enlarge the holes, because whenever you do a thread repair like that, if your bolt is not like perfectly centered in there, or if it's cocked ever so slightly,
these things are never gonna wanna line up. So you had to finesse that a lot. I'm kind of glad that I didn't do some special paint job on these headers because I would have beat them up getting them in there. So right now, we're filling with coolant. We've got oil back in it. The battery is hooked back up. The starter's hooked up. I've got to go buy a spark plug because I broke a spark plug getting the header in that was really tight. These are Autolite 65s. They're like $3. Go grab one of those. And then you guys can see the first start with my brand new headers.
Okay, enough with the open headers. Now, initially I had planned to have something super quiet, which is why I went with these Dynamax Super Turbos. However, it turns out I had purchased the wrong offset, and these were a dual offset muffler, and that just wasn't going to work for spacing, nor really was the X-pipe going to work underneath it for how we wanted to route everything. So when I went to the exhaust shop, we talked a little bit more and decided to go with the exhaust shop brand. It's like a Flowmaster Super 40 and an H-pipe. And take a listen how this thing sounds. It's a little more aggressive than I thought, but absolutely killer. For the record, this vehicle does not have any sort of camshaft in it or anything like that. It's not a high performance build. It is a tired old 360. It's got a dual plane intake, an electronic ignition, and a 650 carb. And that's it. So it sounds super cool. And I think the reason is a lot to do with those headers. The H-pipe helps. You could probably honestly have it sound a little bit more rowdy and more popping on decel if you didn't have the crossover pipe, but I like the crossover pipe. I think it makes it a little bit smoother sounding. And those mufflers, the muffler shop promises me they are just a Flowmaster Super 40. So, but for a fraction of the price. Check out your local muffler shop, pick up a set of those hooker headers, and your truck will sound just like that.